My wife stood in that courtroom and told the judge she'd already moved on months ago. She smiled when she said it. She had no idea that in my jacket pocket was a letter with her hidden bank account, her hotel receipts, and a voicemail she didn't know I'd ever heard. Viewers, before you continue, please subscribe, like and share for more interesting stories. My name is George Knob. I'm 41 years old, a structural engineer by trade, and until 11 years ago I never thought courtrooms would mean anything to me beyond the occasional permit dispute. I live in Kansas City, Missouri, in a house I designed the additions for myself, brick by brick, weekend by weekend, back when I still believed I was building something that would outlast me. That morning, I sat on a hard wooden bench outside courtroom 4B with a folded letter in my jacket pocket, the paper already soft at the creases from being carried too long. My tie felt too tight. My hands wouldn't stop moving. I kept thinking about the man I used to be before all this, the one who worked 80-hour weeks chasing a $40 million infrastructure contract, who believed that providing for someone was the same as loving them. I married Rita George 2 years into that climb, back when money was tight and neither of us knew if the firm would survive its first winter. She used to bring me coffee at the office at midnight, back before midnight meant something else to her. The fluorescent light above me flickered, buzzing faintly, and I watched it instead of the door, because watching the door meant watching for her. When she finally arrived, she was laughing at something on her phone, 15 minutes late, her lawyer trailing a step behind like an afterthought. She didn't look at me. Not once. 11 years, and she walked past me like I was furniture in a hallway she no longer needed to notice. I remember thinking, sitting there, that I had no idea yet how much smaller I still had left to feel before that day was over, and no idea how much of what I thought I knew about my marriage was about to be proven wrong, piece by piece, in front of strangers. I touched the letter in my pocket one more time. I didn't know yet that the woman reading it would be the only person in that room who took it seriously. The courtroom smelled like old carpet and coffee left too long on a burner. Judge Adeline Hoff sat behind the bench, glasses pushed low on her nose, flipping through papers before she'd even called the case. I'd looked her up the night before, 22 years on the family court bench, no patience for theatrics. I hoped that was true. Rita's opening statement painted a version of me I didn't recognize. Cold. Absent. Controlling. She said it with the same tone she used to order takeout, like the words cost her nothing. I sat there and let it happen, because my lawyer had told me 3 times already, let her talk first. What she didn't mention was the 3 years I spent chasing that infrastructure contract, 80-hour weeks, missed dinners, a body that forgot what 8 hours of sleep felt like. $40 million, and I'd told myself it was for us. For the house. For whatever came next. I never once thought about who she was having dinner with while I was still at the office running numbers at 11 at night. Her lawyer, a younger man with a habit of clicking his pen, kept glancing over at her like he was checking his own script. Rita didn't need the help. She leaned into the podium like she'd rehearsed this moment in a mirror. Then she turned and whispered something to him. I couldn't hear it, but I saw the corner of her mouth lift, that small, private smile she used to give me across a room full of people, back when it meant something between us instead of something aimed at me. I didn't know yet what that whisper meant. I only knew it made the back of my neck go cold, the same way it used to when she'd come home late and swear the traffic on I-70 had been unbearable, when I'd already checked the time she left work. The judge cleared her throat and asked her to continue. Rita straightened, glanced back at me one more time, and smiled like she already knew how this would end. She called me predictable. Boring. Said it flat, into the microphone, like she was reading a grocery list. I'd already moved on months ago, she added, and from the gallery behind her, I heard a laugh, quiet, quick, swallowed before the judge could notice. Her sister, Colleen, sat 2 rows back with 2 women I didn't recognize, all 3 of them dressed like they'd come from brunch instead of a divorce hearing. I'd known Colleen disliked me for years. She never said it outright, but she had a way of asking about my father's construction business that always circled back to how it collapsed in 2009, how some men just don't have what it takes to build something that lasts. I used to think she was just protective of her sister. I didn't understand until much later how much of what Rita believed about me had come from Colleen first. My lawyer, a quiet man named Whitfield who rarely raised his voice, leaned toward me. "Now?" he asked. I nodded. I'd carried that letter for 6 weeks by then, through 2 sleepless nights and one afternoon where I sat in my truck outside the house we used to share, trying to decide if I even wanted to go through with it. Revenge wasn't the word I used for it, not in my head. I thought of it more like evidence. Like something a structural engineer does when a building starts cracking in places it shouldn't. You don't guess at the cause, you find it, document it, and show your work. Rita's smile hadn't faded yet. She still thought this was hers to control. She had no idea that somewhere in that folder on Whitfield's table was a printout of a wire transfer she thought no one would ever trace back to her, or that the numbers on it would do more talking than I ever could. Whitfield stood and requested the letter be entered, not as a legal filing, he clarified, but as a personal statement I'd asked the judge to read aloud before any ruling. Rita rolled her eyes, loud enough that a few people in the gallery noticed. The judge looked at me directly for the first time all morning. "You want me to read this into the record?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. She held out her hand, and Whitfield walked the envelope up to the bench. I watched her fingers work the flap open, slow, like she wasn't in any hurry despite the room full of people waiting on her. I'd written that letter the night I found the second account. It wasn't dramatic, the discovery, no confrontation, no yelling. I'd been going through old statements for a mortgage refinance and noticed a transfer I didn't recognize, routed to a bank I'd never heard of. $85,000, moved in pieces over the better part of a year, small enough each time that I might never have noticed if I hadn't been looking for something else entirely. I didn't say anything to her that night. I just sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, staring at numbers, feeling something in my chest go quiet and cold instead of loud. The judge unfolded the pages and read the first line to herself before looking up, and for a second her eyes moved to Rita and stayed there just a beat too long. Rita noticed. I watched her spine straighten, the way it does when someone senses a change in the room before they understand why. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered something, and she waved him off without looking at him, her eyes fixed instead on the judge's face, waiting. The judge started reading, and the first thing she read was a bank routing number and a date. Then a second date. Then a third. $85,000, moved out of our joint savings account in 9 separate transfers over the past year, each one small enough to avoid triggering the kind of alert a bank sends when something looks unusual. Rita's smile disappeared somewhere between the second transfer and the fourth. I watched it go, watched her hand freeze mid-gesture where it had been resting near her water glass. Her lawyer flipped through the folder in front of him with the kind of urgency that told me he was seeing this for the first time, same as everyone else in that room except her. I found out later, though not that day, that the money had gone into a condo downtown, a 2-bedroom unit on the 9th floor with a view of the Power and Light District, already furnished, already lived in on the nights she told me she was staying at Colleen's because she couldn't deal with my hours anymore. I used to feel guilty about those nights. I used to apologize. Someone in the gallery stood up. I didn't recognize him at first, a man in a gray suit, mid-30s maybe, and he walked out without looking at anyone, his footsteps too loud against the tile floor in a room that had gone otherwise silent. The judge paused reading long enough to watch him go, then looked back down at the page like she already understood something the rest of us hadn't caught up to yet. Rita didn't turn around to watch him leave. She stared straight ahead at the judge, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something on her face that looked almost like fear. The judge called a short recess. I stepped out into the hallway to get some air, my collar suddenly too tight, and that's when I saw him again, the man from the gallery, standing near the water fountain with his phone pressed to his ear, talking low and fast. It took me a second, but then it clicked. I'd met him once, almost 2 years ago, at a holiday party for Rita's marketing firm. She'd introduced him as a coworker, someone from the creative team, nothing more. I remembered shaking his hand and thinking nothing of it, the way you don't think twice about most names at a party full of strangers. I stood there in the hallway doing math I didn't want to do. 3 trips over the past year that Rita called work conferences, Chicago in the spring, Denver in the summer, one more in the fall that I couldn't even remember the city for anymore. I'd paid for those trips out of our joint account without a second thought, because why would I doubt her? I trusted her the way you trust a building you designed yourself, certain it was sound because you were the one who poured the foundation. He hung up his phone and walked past me without a word, disappearing around the corner toward the elevators. I didn't follow him. Some part of me already knew I didn't need to. When I stepped back into the courtroom, Rita was watching the door, and for half a second, through the reinforced glass, our eyes met. It wasn't anger on her face. It wasn't even embarrassment. It was something closer to panic, the look of someone watching a structure she'd built start to shift under its own weight, cracks spreading faster than she could patch them. I sat back down next to Whitfield and waited for the judge to return. The judge picked the letter back up where she'd left off, and the next section was harder to sit through than I expected, even though I'd written every word of it myself. Dates. Hotel confirmation numbers. A voicemail transcript from a night Rita had accidentally called me from her purse, 90 seconds of a conversation she never knew I'd heard, let alone saved. Rita's lawyer stood and asked for a pause, said something about needing time to review the material properly. The judge didn't even look up. Denied, she said, and kept reading. I watched Rita's hands on the table, knuckles pale against the dark wood, and I thought about the 4 months I'd spent gathering all of it, bank statements printed at the library so there'd be no trace on our home computer, receipts I'd photographed on my phone during lunch breaks, that voicemail I'd transferred to 3 different devices out of some fear it might vanish before I found the courage to use it. I never confronted her directly, not once during those 4 months. Whitfield asked me about that once, whether I regretted not just asking her outright. I told him no. I'd learned enough from 20 years of engineering to know that when something's wrong with a structure, you don't start banging on the walls hoping it reveals itself. You document. You measure. You let the evidence carry the weight your voice can't. The judge finished the section and set the pages down for a moment, looking at Rita over the top of her glasses. Do you have a response to this, Mrs. George? Rita opened her mouth, then closed it. I'd been married to her for 11 years, and it was the first time I'd ever seen her without something to say. She tried anyway. Said something about stress, about loneliness, about how my hours had left her feeling invisible in her own marriage. I understood, in a distant way, that some of that might even be true. I hadn't been perfect. I'd missed birthdays, forgotten anniversaries twice, let work eat years I couldn't get back. But then the judge asked about the lease on the condo, asked whose name was on it, and Rita's explanation ran out entirely. The name on the lease wasn't mine, and it wasn't hers either. It belonged to a shell arrangement Colleen had helped set up 8 months earlier, a detail Rita clearly hadn't expected to surface in a courtroom on a Tuesday morning. I turned to look at Colleen. She was already standing, gathering her purse, refusing to meet anyone's eyes as she moved toward the exit. I remembered every comment she'd made over the years about my father's failed business, every quiet dig about what I did or didn't have the will to build. I understood now that some of that had never really been about me. It had been cover, laid down early, in case a day like this one ever came. Rita watched her sister go and said nothing. For the first time since I'd walked into that courtroom, she looked entirely alone, no lawyer leaning close with reassurance, no friends in the gallery to catch her eye, no sister waiting to walk out beside her. The judge set the letter down on the bench and looked at me. Not at Rita. At me. It was a small thing, that shift in attention, but it landed heavier than anything that had been said all morning. The ruling came faster than I expected. The judge cited the hidden transfers, the undisclosed asset, the pattern of concealment clear enough that she didn't need to deliberate long. Rita would repay the $85,000, and the difference would come off the top of the settlement in my favor. She read it plainly, without any theater of her own, the way you'd read a measurement off a blueprint. Rita sat frozen through all of it. Her mascara had smudged slightly at the corner of one eye, though I couldn't tell if she'd been crying or just rubbing at her face out of nerves. She didn't look at me once while the judge spoke. I didn't feel the triumph I thought I might. Whitfield had warned me about that, actually, weeks earlier, said people expect relief and instead just feel tired, like they've been carrying something heavy for so long that setting it down doesn't feel like victory, just absence. He was right. I sat there and breathed, and that was about the whole of it. The gavel came down, sharper than I expected in a room that had gone otherwise quiet. I started gathering my things, the copy of the letter, my jacket, the pen I hadn't used once. As I stood to leave, Rita leaned toward me, close enough that no one else caught it. "You think this makes you the good one?" she said, quiet, almost steady again despite everything. I didn't answer her. I just picked up my things and walked toward the door, past Whitfield, past the empty seat where Colleen had been sitting an hour before, out into a hallway that felt different than the one I'd walked through that morning, though I couldn't have said exactly why. Outside, the air had that early cold that hits Kansas City before winter really settles in, sharp enough to notice but not yet cruel. I stood on the courthouse steps for a minute, letting it work through my jacket, watching cars move down the street like nothing unusual had happened that morning at all. 11 years. I kept turning the number over, trying to make it mean something different than it had that morning. I thought about the version of Rita I married, the one who brought coffee to the office at midnight, back before midnight meant something else entirely. I didn't know when that woman had become the one I just watched sit frozen at a defense table, out of excuses, out of allies, out of whatever story she'd been telling herself to make the last 2 years make sense. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt clear-headed, maybe for the first time in over a year, the way a room feels once you've finally found the source of a leak you'd been patching blind for months. I hadn't written that letter for revenge. I'd written it because I was tired of being the only one in that marriage still telling the truth, even to myself. The judge hadn't just ruled that day. She'd confirmed something I'd already known for months but hadn't let myself say out loud. I walked to my truck, unlocked it, sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. I didn't check it right away. What I didn't know yet was that Colleen wasn't finished either, that 3 weeks from that morning, she'd show up unannounced at my office with a folder of her own, and everything I thought I'd already closed the book on would open right back up again.